welcome to a special edition of A House of Policy. I'm Shireen Bhan, a show that attempts to capture the policy changes ushered in by various governments and regulators over the past 2 decades. As we count down to 20 years of CNBC TV 18, we thought it would be appropriate to look back at the decisions that have helped grow the Indian economy, strengthen the capital markets and improve governance standards. We also attempt to look ahead at the opportunities that need to be captured and the challenges that remain unaddressed. To help us map the distance covered and the journey ahead, joining me today is a man who's been involved with policy making both within and outside government, a man who's championed the cause of corporate governance for more than a decade, a man who's been deeply involved with India Inc. as an independent director on several boards. Please welcome the former chairman of market regulator SEBI and the chairperson of Excellence Enablers, Mr. M. Damodaran. Mr. Damodaran, many thanks for joining us here on CNBC TV 18. As we said, we're counting down to 20 years of CNBC TV 18, so we thought it's appropriate to take a look at the seminal policy decisions that have helped shape the economy and the capital markets. I mean, the biggest one would be the opening up of the economy in 1991. But if I were to ask you to prioritize for us some of the other crucial decisions that you believe have been responsible for getting us to where we are today, what would those be?
Well, there are several of them, but let me try and pick a few. If you look at the capital market space, clearly I think dematerialization is one. Corporatization and demutualization of stock exchanges is one. The prevention of the continuing export of India's markets abroad by having the QIPs in place, because otherwise most secondary offerings were going abroad. If the IPOs were done here, every subsequent issue was abroad. That has been reversed. Clearly more disclosures. The fact that we operate today in a disclosure-based regime, not in a so-called merit-based regime where somebody judges the merit of your proposals. All of that, I think, have been huge steps. There is a whole lot of increased accountability that we've seen in the last 20 plus years. And CNBC has been a part of that. You've looked at it fairly closely, not you, the organization, over the last 2 decades and done a good job. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much for that, sir. You've raised several important issues, and let me pick up on each one of those. But I want to pick up on the first point that you talked about the Indian capital markets and what remains unaddressed in terms of its future evolution. One of the comments that came in from the principal advisor to the Ministry of Finance, Sanjeev Sanyal, while we were talking about the aspiration of India becoming an exporting nation, was that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater by imposing very strict norms for KYC. And that, he believes, has led to the export of India's financial services sector outside of India, which he believes is now something that we need to try and bring back. Would you acknowledge that maybe there is some merit there and what needs to be done to address it?
See, before getting to the specifics, let's look at how regulations come into place. There is something that goes wrong. There is a hue and cry, legitimately, that things are going wrong. Then those that are tasked to fix the system decide we need to do this or that. And then you put in place regulations which immediately look like overkill. So you swing from one extreme where there was no regulation to another where regulation makes it difficult to carry on business. And it's not an Indian phenomenon. Sarbanes-Oxley is a classic example. Yes. So you can regulate in haste, repent at leisure, or legislate in haste, repent at leisure. The real issue is then you get a lot of pushback and then you look at it and then you settle on what is right given the circumstances.
I want to pick up on that comment that you made, that there is a tendency, not just in India but globally, of regulating in haste and repenting later. And while you argue that there has been a consultative approach on some key policy decisions, do you fear that we are perhaps moving more into an era where there is less consultation and more regulation in haste, leading to unintended consequences? And we've seen that play out, at least over the last few years.
It sometimes happens that in the minds of the regulator, there is a feeling that you don't have the luxury of time. There is a problem that is happening before you, and you need to fix it. And therefore, you can't go through a process which involves, let's say, natural justice on occasion. And I think even the courts have established that a post-decisional hearing isn't a bad thing. So you impose some restrictions, you put in place some regulations, you hear the other party out, and then maybe if correction is needed, you correct. But sometimes time is of the essence, and therefore there's no time for a leisurely consultative process. Okay. But I'm hoping it's the exception, not the rule.
I want to pick up on the open letter that you wrote to Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman a few months ago. It was in July that you wrote to her.
Yes.
I don't know if you got a response or not, but the point that you were arguing in that letter was that there shouldn't be a sweeping generalization, a tarnishing of the audit community, of the rating agencies, of independent directors, for what we have seen are some bad actors or some sort of bad events that have come to light. Does that continue to be a fear that you have, that we're probably moving to the other extreme of tarnishing entire communities as bad actors?
First, on the instrumentality of an open letter, I don't think an open letter is meant to invite a reply or a response. It's one way of bringing out into the public domain issues that have been bothering you. And I think when you call it an open letter, more people read it, more people comment on it, and the purpose is generally served. To your question, are the issues, the concerns valid? Yes. If anything, they've got a little worse. Between July and now, I think instead of moving in the direction of not tarring everyone with the same brush, whole bunches of professions, people are being treated alike, in not just by the lawmakers and the regulators, but even by the what I call the commentariat. Even they do that. They think, oh, this guy is an auditor, therefore we can't believe what he says. At one time, if an auditor signed off on a piece of paper, you trusted it. It was the gospel truth. A few might have stepped out of line. I'm not for a moment saying that everyone is bathed in milk, far from that. My case is that put in place a system which helps you separate the good from the bad, the bona fide errors from the mala fide decisions. Because if you go around punishing bona fide errors, clearly you're going to have a problem. You mentioned rating agencies. First, as a disclosure, I sit on the board of a rating agency, which is the one that did not rate the IL&FS, except some small portion of that business on some entity some years ago, which was discontinued. But today we're finding a situation where rating agencies are having the regulator looking over their shoulders, saying what should be done, what should not be done, putting in place additional requirements. Good, if you've caught out somebody, punish that person. But in the process, do not undermine the credibility of a rating agency itself. Because if rating agency's credibility is undermined, who does that job? Somebody has to do that job. So you need to improve them. And that doesn't come by talk about putting public interest directors on the board of a rating agency. Rating agency boards don't rate. They don't know what is rated. They're not supposed to know that. That's not the function of the board. Take auditors, for example. If you said all auditors are not measuring up, then who would do the work that auditors today do? Independent directors. I know a number of them who do a lot of work, to see that the promoters remain on the straight and narrow path. You don't hear about them. You hear about the ones that allegedly slipped in the boardroom, because that makes good news. I think somewhere you need to have, and this is what I had recommended in that letter, have a panel of people that you trust. Let them do the first filtration of what is mala fide, what is bona fide. And after that, where it appears to be prima facie mala fide, let the law take its course. Who says no?
Since you raised the issue of independent directors, and yes, many questions are being asked of independent directors and the role that they play, you're concerned that in our quest to punish the bad actors, we might lose the pipeline of independent directors altogether. Now, there is this proposal to try and bring in a proficiency test.
Yes.
What do you make of that idea as a remedy to the context of what we're facing today?
Well, the proficiency test has already been brought in.
Yes.
I mean, the requirement for a test. Somebody will now prepare, hopefully, a question bank which is sensible and then check out. What are they being checked out for? What the Act says is that they are being checked out for securities law, company law, and for an understanding of the basic principles of accountancy. Now, armed with this 60% plus in this proficiency test, you sit in a boardroom. Are you going to be a better director? Does this equip you to, with a mature mind, look at issues, strategy, look at alternatives that are presented to the board? I've always believed that the board has three tasks: superintendence, direction, and control. How much of these proficiencies that this test is ascertaining helps you to do that better than you're doing today, number one. Number two, this is premised on the assumption that the boards that did not measure up, did not have people who understood securities law, or you don't have to understand which section, you need to know where to find it, or the company law or accountancy. Are you saying that those boards didn't have? They had phenomenal people. There is a problem of asymmetry of information. Did they get to know enough? Because there are only two issues in corporate governance: asymmetry of information, conflict of interest.
Right.
These are the only two issues.
And the proficiency test doesn't address either.
It goes nowhere near that. In fact, I am not exactly looking forward to it, but it could happen that you would have boardrooms with people armed with, copies of the Companies Act with commentaries, and they can, if you get a Ramaya, it's 6 volumes, and this, and coming to the board, and anything that comes up, quickly thumbing through that and say, no, but this is, have you certified this? Or have you cleared that? Are we in sync with this? There is a company secretary, for God's sake, whose job it is to ensure compliance. There is a CFO whose job it is to ensure that the right numbers are brought to the board. Are we saying that all of these people are crooks and need to be looked at by independent directors who come in 4 or 5 times a year and have asymmetry of information? Is that what we're saying? I don't think this test is the answer. It's unprecedented. No other country has this.
If proficiency tests are not the answer, if excessive regulation is not the answer, then how do you ensure that boards remain independent, that boards in fact stand for the minority shareholder, that boards don't go along with everything that the promoter or a marquee CEO says, which is the problem that we're faced with in India?
I'll tell you, all of this and more is getting addressed in a 2-day seminar that I'm doing 2 days from now.
Nicely plugged.
No, I'm not getting away from this. What is the one thing that needs to be done? Is a very robust, critical board evaluation process. You don't have that. You prescribed a board evaluation process, and you've allowed companies to do self-evaluation. Is that an honest evaluation? You prepare a few questions, or everyone tells everyone else in the boardroom. You coexisted with that person in that room for years. Are you going to say this guy doesn't measure up? You are not going to say that. So what you give in response to a written questionnaire is not the honest truth, and I'm putting it bluntly. We've had experience. I do board consulting. I do board evaluations. When you talk to people and they tell you, this guy, should have left the board long ago, and you tell the person, that's not what you have said in your written response to this short questionnaire, you say, you don't expect me to write down all of that. So you get to hear that too. Get outside experts who have boardroom experience to come and evaluate your boards, if not every year, every alternate year. 1 year you do your in-house, no problem. Second year you get somebody from the outside, but people who bring boardroom experience, not people who read up books and come. That's not the answer. If you have an honest board evaluation, at the end of the day, there must be recognition across the board that you need to keep the good persons inside and let the bad ones go. What can facilitate that other than an evaluation process? Not examinations. I may cram up some things and get 99 out of 100. Am I a great director? No.
But do you see takers for this evaluation process that you're talking of?
Well, some companies have done that voluntarily. They don't have to go outside. Safety lies in doing it in-house. Do
you believe it should be made mandatory?
It must be prescribed that once in 2 years you want to start, once in 3 years you want. It's not terribly expensive. I look at it as an investment, and I've told people that a good, robust evaluation process is an investment in your company. It's not expenditure.
Okay, it's an investment, not an expenditure. But speaking of remedies that have already been prescribed, and we're going to see one coming into effect early next year, which is splitting up the chairman and the managing director's position. How effective do you believe that is going to be to discharge the responsibilities of the board that you spoke of?
More than 10 years ago, I think I must have been one of the first in India at least who said, and I will tell you the exact words I said, that combining the roles of the chairman and the chief executive with the same individual is the ultimate negation of corporate governance. The head of management is accountable for running the company in the interest of stakeholders. The head of the board, which is the chair, is the person responsible on behalf of the board to hold management accountable. How can both these functions reside in the same person? The chairman, are you saying that person is accountable to who asks questions, who answers? I think there is a very strong case for splitting it. I know that very respected leaders of corporate India have argued against it, saying it is against Indian ethos. It's not the way business has been built in India. And these are people for whom I have the greatest respect and affection. But I think they're looking at their companies. They're not looking at the universe of companies. And the law is not made for good companies. Law is made for those who need law to tell them what is good. Good companies don't need to tell them that. But these statements have come from people who don't need the law to tell them that, and therefore seeing this as excessive. There are three elements to this separation. Should you split these two jobs? 100%. It should have been done day before yesterday. Two, should the chairman be non-executive? And you've heard things about the chairman must be executive. Well, the managing director cannot be non-executive.
Right.
And you shouldn't have two executive people. If the chairman is executive, again, the same problem.
Sure.
He is part of operations. How does he sit in judgment? So I think the chairman must be non-executive. The positions must be split. The third element, which is a first in India, that the chairman and the managing director or CEO should not be related, which I think is overkill.
Okay.
In this day and age, no son automatically agrees with his father, or no daughter agrees with the mother. Yes. And therefore, to think that because they're related, one will agree with the other is incorrect. Of course, you don't want an extreme case like one of India's celebrated companies, which at a point of time had an executive chairman and executive vice chairman.
Right.
And a chief executive officer. I was wondering whether he would be designated non-executive because you have two executives sitting on top of him. So you don't want that kind of clumsiness. But a non-executive chairman, the posts being split, and I think you should park this thing about should they be related or not. It doesn't trouble me if they're related.
Okay. On one of the other important issues that we're grappling with today is how should boards deal with whistleblower complaints? I know that you've personally had to deal with this issue at Interglobe Aviation. We're dealing with this at Infosys. Now the question is, every time you get a whistleblower complaint, is it incumbent on the board to make the disclosure, or should the board first run its own checks and see whether this merits disclosure or not? What do you believe is the way forward on this?
See, whistleblower mechanism was intended and can still function as an excellent mechanism to unearth things that need to be unearthed in a company. That's fair. Like every good instrument, it can also be used wrongly. You can use it to settle scores. You can use it to take pot shots at people. And to your point, should somebody do a screening before it's disclosed? Absolutely. Now, people might say sunlight is the best disinfectant. I'm not quarreling with that. A celebrated US judge first said it at the turn of the century. I'm not quarreling with that at all. While sunlight is a good disinfectant, sunburn can hurt. How quickly do you disclose? How soon do you disclose? You may, by way of a premature disclosure, be reinforcing a falsehood. If the whistleblower's complaint is not true, by putting it out on the exchanges prematurely, you might actually be spreading this falsehood, which is in no one's interest. It is important that whistleblowers first send the complaint within the company. That is how the mechanism works. It's quickly investigated. You don't have the luxury of time. There are instrumentalities to see that it doesn't go to the management. It goes to the audit committee. If it's a problem with the audit committee, where should it go? All of that can be taken care of. And in fact, is taken care of. Then you get to a situation where there is some doubt about something. That's the stage at which you tell the exchange, we are looking into this in more detail. Maybe we've got outside help also to do this. And we've received this complaint because prima facie, there could be something that is verifiable and needs verification. But it does not mean that merely because it looks credible and is well drafted, you think it's right and put it out. Early premature disclosure can be counterproductive. I don't know about the specifics of any case. I don't want to. But this is again a mechanism that needs to be, it needs to be tested. Over time, we'll get to know how to put in place these safety measures.
Well, speaking of, the role of the regulator, sir, and I'm asking you this as the former chief of SEBI, the job of whether it's the courts or regulators or the government is that they should also operate in an environment of transparency. And unfortunately, the criticism is that there is opacity, especially when it comes to the way that regulators deal with information. And the asymmetry of information that you spoke of is a criticism that lands often at the door of the regulator as well. As we move ahead, what do you believe needs to change in the way that the regulator itself chooses to communicate?
Let me step back and go back to the beginning of this conversation. You mentioned policies. I've always believed that a good policy framework is one where there is continuity of policy, there's clarity of policy. It doesn't have to change every day. I thought I needed to mention that before I get to the regulators. See, regulation, and I've said this before, cannot be conducted in the open. There is a process which involves some confidentiality. There are persons that give you evidence, that there are documents that you access. What is the problem? The problem is that you are not doing it quickly enough. You need to actually deal with these matters very quickly. If you brought speed into the process, there would be less comfort with the way the regulators function than the less discomfort. And nobody says that, every witness that they examine, every statement should be out there. And then communication is important for regulators. It's important. I know a celebrated former Reserve Bank governor focused on this. He said, why you need to communicate clearly. I'm talking about Dr. Reddy. Why you need to communicate clearly so that there's no confusion. If communication leads to confusion, then you're not communicating. So regulators must communicate. Regulators must do the work of surveillance, investigation, and enforcement much faster than it's happening now. I think it's moving in that direction. I am not saying that it's not moving. Long way to go. You need to build capacity. You cannot blame a regulatory organization. Today, financial frauds, etc., are so complex that you need specialized people to go into them if necessary, get them on contract basis. I did have this proposal many years ago, but it was shot down very quickly, saying that, no, you're embarking on some unknown territory. I think that's what you need to have. If you have a complex case, you need to bring in experts from the outside, pay them what it takes, do it quickly, get it out of there, because these have not case-wise implications. There are systemic implications.
Absolutely, there are systemic implications. Let me end then by asking you about what you make of the resolution framework that's been put in place via the IBC, and now there is an interim mechanism that's been put out by the government to also look at financial service providers as part of the IBC process. What do you make of the manner in which the resolution process has taken off and has evolved?
Give me a slightly larger canvas to paint. We had no worthwhile resolution process before all of this came. Clearly, this was a system, these were institutions, and there was a law to ensure that some sanctity was brought into this process, some speed was brought into this process. courtesy a series of initial missteps. You had conflicting orders, you had orders which were the exact opposite of what the law intended it to be, etc. Luckily, one of those has been settled by the Supreme Court a couple of days ago, and the bankers and others will breathe a little easier that they don't have to grapple. They are. I think as of day before yesterday, bankers are much happier people because the Supreme Court has ruled on this, and there's no going back on that. Now, when you're extending it, I have no problem with extending. Don't call it interim. Do something. It's not rocket science. You can think through this quickly and put in place what you think is appropriate. Nobody trusts an interim arrangement, knowing how long it will last, or not knowing how long it will last. More important is capacity building. You set up all these NCLTs, etc. What about building capacity in those organizations to understand the complexities of the cases, deal with them quickly without sacrificing natural justice? You've got to go through the process, but deal with it quickly. Is that happening quickly enough? Are the timelines that the statute contemplates, being respected?
Which now the Supreme Court says is not mandatory.
While it might not be mandatory, if it carries on for, ever and a day,
it defeats the purpose.
It defeats the entire. You need to see that money come back to those whose money it is.
Absolutely.
And then this confusion between operational creditors, then the business of whether homeowners should come in, secured, unsecured. It's time we bury all of this, bring some clarity to who gets what, who stands where in the queue. And once that is there, life will go on smoothly.
Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for stopping by.
Thank you. My pleasure.